what's happening in Galatia is you see outside troublemakers who are coming in and they're wanting to pervert the gospel. Now we have to say, don't we, that's Paul's perspective. I don't think that the opponents themselves would have described themselves that way. They would have described themselves as adding to the gospel in a positive way. But Paul is arguing that what you have here is a distortion, actually, of the gospel by these troublemakers. In fact, he refers to them again in chapter 5, verse 10. He says, I'm confident in the Lord that you will take no other view. The one who is throwing you into confusion, the one who's troubling you, whoever that may be, will have to pay the penalty. Actually, Paul uses the same word here for troublemakers. So we have these outside people who are troubling the Galatians. Paul also teaches here that the truth of the gospel depends on its content, not the credentials of the messenger. That's a very important point, isn't it? He says whether it's I myself or whether it's an angel from heaven, if I preach another gospel, it ought not to be accepted. So the truth of the gospel, it must align with the content that was proclaimed. A person can't just claim I'm inspired and whatever I say is true. That content must line up with what the gospel is. And in fact, Paul says if someone departs from that gospel, they are cursed, which is a very strong statement, isn't it? The word for curse there, anathema, refers to final destruction and final condemnation. So this is no light matter. Paul uses this word as well in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 22. If anyone does not love the Lord, let that person be cursed, or anathema. So clearly this curse is talking about that final destruction. In the Old Testament, the word is cherem, for that which is absolutely destroyed, that which is devoted to destruction. So the controversy here isn't about something that's not important, but it's a vital importance. We see this word cursed again in Leviticus. No person, Leviticus chapter 27, verse 29, no person devoted to destruction may be ransomed. And it's in our word destruction. They may not be ransomed. They are to be put to death. And we see it again in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 26. Do not bring a detestable thing into your house, or you like it will be set apart for destruction. There's our word cursed again, or destroyed. Regarded as vile and utterly detested, for it is set apart for destruction. So that's the background that we have here. And we see in Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 through 11, that false prophets will be put to death. So Paul says something very strong about these opponents, doesn't he? That those who proclaim or receive another gospel will end up being cursed by God. Verse 10 is a transitional verse. Paul used very strong words in verses 8 and 9. Those strong words show that he's not trying to please people. I think the opponents were arguing that Paul didn't bring up circumcision because he was trying to please people. But Paul's strong words in verses 8 and 9 show that he's not trying to please people. Unless you're kind of a crabby person, you don't try to please people by telling them that if they disagree with you, they'll be destroyed and cursed by God. So Paul uses those very strong words, not because he's in a bad mood. He uses those very strong words to indicate the seriousness of the issue before them. And it also shows that he's not trimming back the gospel just to please people. He's saying what he's saying because it is the truth that God has revealed to him. So in terms of application of this text today, we see three things that I think are notable. First of all, we're all prone to wander from God's grace and goodness. That's in a very famous hymn, isn't it? Prone to wander. Lord, I know it, prone to leave the God I love. Well, we see that in the Galatians, don't we? And presumably we see it in our own lives, that there's a tendency amongst believers to wander from the gospel and to wander from God. That isn't only a Galatian problem, but it's also a problem of people today. Secondly, we see that Paul argues that there's only one gospel. And clearly Paul teaches exclusivism here, which is not very popular today, but it wasn't very popular in Paul's day either. We think of Acts chapter 4, verse 12, and there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Or what Jesus said in John 14:6, Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Sometimes people say if we are teaching what the scriptures say and that there's only one way, sometimes people say, well, we're arrogant and we're proud, but we're actually not being arrogant, we're actually being humble. Because in saying what we say, we're depending on what is revealed to us. So we want to make it clear to people, don't we? We're not saying this because we want to be annoying in some way. We say this simply to be faithful to the revelation that is given to us. We're not wiser than God. We are relying humbly on what he's taught us, and hopefully that comes across in our disposition as we talk to people who disagree with us and with whom we share the gospel. And thirdly, our goal in life isn't to please people, but to please God. That can be a very tempting thing, can't it, to please people. Jesus says, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me, but if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe since you accept glory from one another, but do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? So there's a temptation in our lives, right, to want to receive glory and honor and approbation from other people. When that happens, then we may not seek God's glory and miss out on what God has for us in Jesus Christ. So that's a common temptation that we all face. We want people to like us naturally. We have to make sure that that desire does not become so prominent in our lives that the gospel is ignored or even denied.